The night he begged was the night everyone realized power doesn't always belong to the one who had it first. The crystal chandelier light shimmered across the marble floor as a man in a tailored suit dropped to his knees, his voice breaking just enough for the silence to stretch across the entire ballroom. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the executives holding their champagne glasses, not the women whispering behind diamond-studded fans, not even the cameras that had already started recording what millions would later call the most humiliating moment of a millionaire's life. Because Daniel Whitmore, the man who once controlled everything in that room, was now looking up at Ava Johnson like she held his entire future in her hands. And the truth was, she did. But what none of them knew, what none of them could see behind the calm expression on her face and the quiet strength in her posture, was that 3 years earlier, Ava Johnson had been standing barefoot on a cold sidewalk at 2 in the morning, 8 months pregnant, holding a single suitcase with everything she had left after. The man now kneeling in front of her had told her she was no longer part of his life. The city had been different that night, louder somehow, harsher, the streetlights flickering like they couldn't decide whether to stay on or give up, just like she almost did, and the rain had soaked through her coat, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin but settles deep into your bones. And she remembered how the door behind her had closed with a final sound that didn't echo but lingered, as if it had sealed something permanent, something irreversible. And for a long moment she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even think, because when everything you believed in disappears in a single second, your mind doesn't know where to go next. And yet somehow, she had taken one step forward, then another, because there was a life inside her that depended on it, a reason to keep moving even when every instinct told her to stop. And that was the part Daniel never understood, the part he dismissed when he chose convenience over loyalty, when he decided that her lowest moment was the right time to walk away, because he believed weakness was permanent, that once someone fell, they stayed there. But what he failed to see was that sometimes the lowest point is not the end of a story. It is the exact place where something else begins, something quieter, something stronger, something that doesn't need permission to grow. And now, standing in a room filled with people who once would have ignored her, Ava adjusted the sleeve of her tailored jacket with a calm precision that felt almost effortless, her reflection briefly catching in the polished surface of a nearby glass table, not to admire it, but to recognize it, because the woman looking back at her was not the same one who had stood in the rain that night. And as Daniel's voice cracked again, softer this time, almost unrecognizable, asking for something he had once thrown away without hesitation, Ava finally looked down at him, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with a quiet understanding that the moment unfolding in front of everyone had been set in motion long before he ever realized he had lost control. And the real story, the part no one in that room had heard yet, was how she went from that cold sidewalk to owning the very ground he now stood on. The rain that night did not stop. It followed her for blocks as Ava walked without direction, each step slower than the last, her hand resting on her stomach as if it was the only thing anchoring her to reality, because everything else had already been taken, and the city that once felt familiar now looked like a place that did not recognize her anymore. The buildings taller, the streets colder, the people passing by without even a glance, and somewhere between one streetlight and the next, the weight of it all finally settled in, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the kind of realization that does not break you in one moment, but presses down slowly until you understand that nothing you had before is coming back. And yet she kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the truth she was not ready to accept, that the man she built her life around had chosen to continue forward without her, as if she had been something temporary, something replaceable. And that realization was heavier than the suitcase in her hand, heavier than the exhaustion pulling at her body, heavier than the future she could not yet see. And then, just as her steps began to falter, a car slowed beside her, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to be noticed, the headlights casting a soft glow across the wet pavement. And for a moment she hesitated, because trust had already cost her everything once, and she was not sure she had any left to give. But the window rolled down and a voice, calm and steady, broke through the noise of the rain, asking a simple question that did not demand, did not assume, just offered, "Are you all right?" and something about the way it was said, without pressure, without expectation, made her pause long enough to answer, even if the answer itself was incomplete. Because how do you explain in a single sentence that your entire life has just been erased? How do you compress loss, betrayal, and uncertainty into words that make sense to someone who is not there to witness it? So instead, she said nothing, just shook her head slightly, and that was enough. The car door opened, not as an instruction but as an option, and after a moment that felt longer than it was, Ava stepped forward, not because she trusted the stranger completely, but because she trusted the part of herself that knew she could not stay where she was. And inside the car, the warmth hit her first, then the quiet, a kind of silence that felt different from the one outside, less empty, more intentional. And as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the place where everything had ended, Ava did not realize that she was also leaving behind the version of herself that had accepted being overlooked, because the man sitting in the driver's seat, Marcus Hale, did not ask for her story that night, did not offer promises or solutions. He simply drove, and in that quiet, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to begin. Because sometimes the most important moment in a person's life is not when everything falls apart, but when they choose, even without knowing how, to keep going anyway. The car did not stop at a grand building or a place that felt intimidating. Instead, it pulled quietly into a modest apartment complex where the lights in the windows felt warm and lived in, the kind of place where no one asked questions they did not need answers to. And when Ava stepped out, her legs felt unsteady, not from fear but from exhaustion that had finally caught up with her. And Marcus did not rush her, did not fill the silence with empty reassurance. He simply walked a few steps ahead and opened the door, holding it long enough for her to decide to follow. And inside the apartment, everything was simple, clean, intentional. A small space with a couch, a kitchen, and a blanket folded neatly as if it had been waiting. And for a moment Ava stood there, unsure of what came next, because kindness without conditions felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, and yet nothing in the room suggested control, nothing demanded anything from her. And that was what made it different. Marcus placed a glass of water on the table and spoke in the same steady tone, telling her she could stay as long as she needed, no expectations, no pressure, just time. And time was something she had not realized she needed until that moment, because everything in her life before had been rushed, decided, dictated by someone else. And now, for the first time in a long time, there was space to breathe. The first night she barely slept, her body curled slightly, as if still protecting something fragile, her mind replaying every moment that led her there, every word, every silence, every sign she had ignored. But morning came anyway, soft light through the window, the sound of distant traffic, and the realization that she was still here, still moving forward whether she was ready or not. And Marcus was already gone by the time she woke up, leaving behind a note on the counter with a number and a simple message that said to call if she needed anything. Nothing more, no explanation of who he was or why he helped. And that absence of control became the first real shift, because instead of being told what to do, Ava had to decide for herself. And that decision began quietly. She found a small job within days. Nothing glamorous, just enough to start rebuilding something of her own. And it was not easy. Every step forward felt heavier than it should have. Every task a reminder of how far she had fallen. But there was something steady growing beneath that weight, something that did not rely on anyone else's approval. And weeks turned into months. The apartment that once felt temporary began to feel like a starting point. Not a place of loss, but a place of change. And throughout it all, Marcus remained distant but present, never interfering, never asking for anything in return, only appearing when necessary and disappearing just as quietly. And Ava began to notice something she had missed before, that the people who truly change your life are not always the ones who speak the loudest or promise the most. Sometimes they are the ones who give you the space to become someone new. And what she did not know yet, what she could not have predicted in those early days of rebuilding, was that every small decision she was making, every step forward that felt almost invisible, was leading her toward a moment where the balance of power would shift completely. And the man who once decided her future would soon realize he was no longer part of it at all. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything suddenly changed. Instead, it unfolded slowly, Almost quietly, like something building beneath the surface that no one could see yet, Ava's days became structured, deliberate, each hour accounted for, each decision intentional. She worked early mornings and late evenings, taking on responsibilities that most people overlooked, not because they were easy, but because they required consistency, and consistency was something. She had learned to rely on more than promises. The small job she started with turned into something more stable, then something more demanding, and with every new challenge she accepted, there was a subtle shift in how people responded to her. At first they barely noticed her, then they acknowledged her, and eventually they began to depend on her, and that transition, from invisible to necessary, became the foundation of everything that followed. But what made the difference was not just the work, it was the way she approached it. She paid attention to details others ignored. She listened when others spoke just to be heard, and she asked questions not to impress, but to understand. And over time those habits began to separate her from everyone else around her. Because while others focused on short-term success, Ava was building something deeper, something that could not be taken away as easily as it had been before, and Marcus noticed, not through constant observation, but through results, through the quiet ways her progress began to show. And one evening, months after that first night, he asked her a question that changed the direction of everything, not about her past, not about what happened, but about what she wanted next. And for a moment she did not have an answer, because wanting something again meant risking something again, and risk had cost her more than she thought she could afford. But the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was patient, giving her space to consider something she had avoided. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, not certain, but willing, and that was enough. Marcus did not respond with approval or excitement. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a decision that had already begun forming long before she said it out loud. And in the weeks that followed, opportunities started appearing, not handed to her, but placed within reach. Introductions to people who spoke in terms of investments and growth, access to rooms where conversations carried weight, and at first Ava felt out of place, aware of every difference between where she came from and where she was now standing. But she did not retreat. She stayed, observed, learned, and adapted, because she understood something now that she had not before, that belonging is not given, it is built. And the more she stepped into those spaces, the less unfamiliar they became, until one day she realized she was no longer the outsider trying to catch up. She was part of the conversation shaping what came next, and what she did not know, what Daniel could not have imagined from the life he dismissed so easily, was that the same woman he believed had nothing left was quietly positioning herself in a world that would soon intersect with his in a way he would never see coming. By the time Ava walked into her first real boardroom, she no longer hesitated at the door. The quiet uncertainty that once followed her had been replaced with something steadier, something earned, and while the people seated around the long glass table spoke in numbers that once would have intimidated her, projections, percentages, valuations in the tens of millions, she listened with a clarity that cut through the noise. Because she was no longer trying to prove she belonged there. She was focused on understanding how everything connected, and that shift changed everything. Her questions became sharper, her observations more precise, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic in the room began to adjust. People who once overlooked her started pausing when she spoke, considering what she said, and in a world where attention was currency, that was the first sign of real influence. Marcus remained in the background as he always had, never introducing her as anything more than her name, never attaching his reputation to hers. And at first Ava wondered why, until she realized that he was not positioning her as someone supported. He was allowing her to be seen as someone capable, and that distinction mattered more than any title he could have given her. The projects she took on grew larger, more complex, each one building on the last. And with each success came access to something new, a different network, a different level of conversation, until one afternoon, sitting across from a group of investors discussing an acquisition opportunity, she heard a name that felt distant and familiar at the same time, Whitmore Holdings, and for a brief moment the room seemed to narrow, not because she was unprepared, but because the past had quietly stepped into the present without warning. She did not react outwardly. Her expression remained composed, her posture unchanged, but internally something shifted, not pain, not anger, but awareness, because the company being discussed was not the same one she had once been connected to. It was struggling, mismanaged, carrying decisions that were beginning to show cracks beneath the surface. And as the conversation continued, Ava saw what others were missing, patterns that did not align, projections that did not account for certain realities, and more importantly, an opportunity hidden inside what everyone else viewed as risk. And when the room turned to her, expecting a routine response, she spoke with a level of clarity that changed the direction of the discussion entirely, outlining not just the problems, but the potential, not just the weaknesses, but the leverage points that could transform them. And for the first time, the name Whitmore was no longer tied to something she had lost. It was connected to something she could control. The room fell into a thoughtful silence, the kind that follows when something unexpected shifts the entire perspective. And Marcus, watching without interruption, gave the smallest nod, not approval, but recognition, because in that moment Ava was not reacting to her past. She was redefining it. And what no one else in that room fully understood yet was that the decision they were about to make, the deal they were beginning to consider, would not just impact a company. It would quietly place Ava Johnson in a position where the next time she stood across from Daniel Whitmore, it would not be as someone he had left behind, but as someone who now had the power to decide what happened next. The decision was not made in a dramatic vote or a sudden agreement. It unfolded through quiet nods, measured questions, and the subtle shift of attention toward Ava, as if the room itself had begun to align with her perspective. And by the end of the meeting, what had started as a risky consideration became a strategic move, an acquisition structured carefully, deliberately, with layers that only those paying close attention would fully understand. And Ava did not rush the process. She moved with precision, reviewing documents line by line, understanding every clause, every condition, because she knew this was not just another opportunity. It was a turning point, and weeks passed as negotiations progressed, each stage revealing more about the company that once defined a chapter of her life. Whitmore Holdings was no longer the polished empire it appeared to be on the surface. There were gaps in leadership, inconsistencies in financial reporting, decisions made too quickly and without long-term vision. And as those details became clearer, so did the reality that Daniel was no longer in control the way he believed he was. But what made the situation more significant was not just the company's vulnerability. It was the way Ava positioned herself within it, not as a direct figure, not as someone stepping into the spotlight, but as a silent force behind the structure being built around it. Marcus guided the broader strategy, but never dictated her role, and that allowed Ava to step forward on her own terms, learning not just how to participate in high-level decisions, but how to shape them. And with every conversation, every adjustment to the deal, her influence grew, not loudly, not in ways that demanded recognition, but in ways that changed outcomes, until the final agreement was ready, and the signatures that would formalize everything were placed with a calm that contrasted sharply with the magnitude of what had just happened. Because in that moment, ownership shifted, not entirely, not visibly to the outside world, but enough for control to begin moving in a different direction. And Daniel did not know, not yet, because from his perspective the deal was just another business transaction, another adjustment in a market that he believed he understood. And that was the difference. He was still reacting, still operating from a place of assumption, while Ava was moving with intention, already several steps ahead. And as the days passed, small changes began to appear within the company, new policies, new oversight, subtle shifts that did not attract attention individually, but together created a new structure, one that Daniel would soon feel but not immediately recognize. And then came the invitation, a formal event, a gathering of investors, executives, and industry leaders, the kind of setting where appearances mattered and narratives were reinforced. And Ava received it without surprise, as if she had been expecting it all along, because she understood that moments like this were not just social. They were strategic. They were where perception met reality. And as she prepared to attend, selecting each detail with the same care she had applied to every step of her journey, there was no hesitation in her movements, no trace of the uncertainty that once followed her, only a quiet certainty that the next time she stood in the same space as Daniel Whitmore, it would not be as someone he could overlook, but but as someone he would have no choice but to face, even if he did not yet understand why. The night of the event arrived with a kind of quiet anticipation that could not be seen, but could be felt in the way the city lights reflected off glass towers and polished streets. And as Ava stepped out of the car, the soft hum of conversation from inside the venue carried through the open entrance, blending with the distant sound of traffic and the subtle rhythm of heels against marble. She paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because she understood that moments like this were not defined by how they began, but by what they revealed. And as she walked inside, the room adjusted in ways that were almost imperceptible. Conversation slowed, eyes shifted, not because people recognized her immediately, but because presence has a way of announcing itself before introductions are made. And Ava moved through the space with a calm precision, acknowledging greetings, returning polite smiles, never overextending, never diminishing herself, each interaction measured, intentional. And as the evening unfolded, the layers of the room began to reveal themselves, clusters of investors discussing numbers in quiet corners, executives reinforcing alliances with carefully chosen words, and in the center of it all, Daniel Whitmore, standing with the confidence of someone who believed he was still in control, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, unaware that the structure beneath him had already begun to shift. Ava noticed him before he noticed her, not because she was looking for him, but because she recognized the patterns of the room, the way attention subtly gravitated toward him out of habit rather than necessity. And for a moment, the distance between who they had been and who they were now existed in the same space, separated not by time, but by transformation. And when his gaze finally met hers, the change was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. A brief pause, a flicker of recognition followed by something less certain, because the person he was looking at did not align with the version he remembered. And that was the first crack, the moment where assumption met reality and failed to reconcile. And Ava did not move toward him. She did not acknowledge him beyond that single glance, because control is not asserted through reaction, it is established through restraint. And as the evening continued, the conversations around her began to shift in tone, subtle references to the recent acquisition, quiet acknowledgement of new leadership influence, and Daniel, still unaware of the full extent, began to sense something changing without understanding its source, his interactions slightly more measured, his attention dividing between maintaining appearances and searching for clarity. And then came the moment that brought everything into focus, an announcement, simple in its delivery, but significant in its implication, recognizing the new strategic stakeholders behind Whitmore Holdings, and as names were mentioned, as roles were outlined in terms that carried weight without revealing everything. The room responded with interest, curiosity, and for some, realization, and Daniel listened, his expression controlled but his eyes narrowing just enough to reveal that he was beginning to understand that the narrative he believed he was directing had already moved beyond him. And when Ava stepped forward, not to speak, not to explain, but simply to stand within that acknowledgement, the space around her shifted completely, because now the connection was no longer abstract. It was visible, undeniable, and in that moment, the distance between them disappeared, replaced by a reality that neither of them could ignore. That the woman he once left behind was now standing within the structure that would determine what came next, and the words he had yet to say, the questions he had yet to ask, were already forming in the silence between them, waiting for the moment when he would have no choice but to speak. The silence between them did not last long. It rarely does when something important is about to be said, and Daniel was the first to move, not with confidence this time, but with a careful urgency, the kind that comes when control begins to slip and questions start forming faster than answers. He approached her with a measured pace, aware now that every step was being watched, not just by the room, but by the weight of what had already been revealed. And when he finally stood in front of her, close enough to see the details he had once overlooked, the calm in her expression, the steadiness in her eyes, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if recalibrating everything he thought he knew. Ava did not speak first. She did not offer acknowledgement or reaction. She simply stood there, composed, allowing the moment to settle into its full weight. And that was what shifted the balance completely. Because for the first time, Daniel was the one searching for words, his voice lower, than before, controlled but edged with something unfamiliar, uncertainty, as he asked a question that sounded simple but carried everything beneath it. "How are you here?" And Ava met his gaze without resistance, without tension, just clarity. And when she answered, her voice was even, precise, not meant to explain but to state, the same way she had learned to speak in rooms where every word mattered. She said she made choices. And for a moment that answer seemed too small, too quiet, but that was because it did not need to be louder. It carried more truth than anything else he could have expected. Daniel studied her, as if looking for something that would make it make sense, some sign that this was temporary, that it could be undone, but there was nothing in her presence that suggested that. No hesitation, no lingering attachment to what had been, only the calm certainty of someone who had already moved beyond it. And around them the room continued to shift, conversations pausing just enough to observe, to understand that something significant was unfolding in a way that did not need to be announced to be recognized. And then Daniel's tone changed, subtly, but enough to reveal the direction his thoughts were moving, from confusion to realization, from realization to something closer to regret. And he spoke again, this time not asking how, but asking why she had not reached out, why she had not said anything, as if the responsibility for the distance between them could be redirected. And Ava listened without interruption, not because she needed to consider his words, but because she understood them completely. She had heard versions of them before, the quiet expectation that she should have remained within the boundaries he defined, that her absence required explanation. And when he finished, she did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to return, not as avoidance, but as emphasis. And when she finally spoke, her words were simple, measured, and final. She said that some chapters do not require revisiting, and the meaning settled between them with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Daniel's expression shifted again, the confidence that once defined him replaced with something less stable, because for the first time he was not the one deciding the outcome of the conversation, he was reacting to it. And Ava, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, had already established something he could not easily reclaim, that the connection he thought he could return to no longer existed in the way he remembered. And as she stepped slightly to the side, not to leave, but to continue moving through the room on her own terms, it became clear that whatever he had come to say next, whatever he believed he could fix or recover, would not unfold the way he expected, because the moment he thought he could control had already passed before he even realized it had begun. The space she left behind did not close when Ava stepped away. It expanded, because absence in a moment like that does not diminish presence, it amplifies it. And Daniel stood there for a second longer than he intended, his posture still composed, but his focus no longer anchored, his mind moving through possibilities that did not align with the reality he had just encountered. Because what unsettled him was not just her success, it was the way she carried it, without hesitation, without the need to prove anything. And that was something he could not easily categorize. As Ava continued through the room, the energy around her shifted in a way that was now unmistakable. Conversations adjusted to include her, not out of courtesy, but because her position demanded it. And names that once held weight in isolation were now spoken in relation to hers. Subtle acknowledgments of influence that did not require explanation. And Daniel, watching from a distance that felt both physical and something else, began to piece together fragments of what he had missed, the acquisition, the restructuring, the quiet changes that had been happening within his company without fully revealing their source. And now the pattern was beginning to form, not complete, but enough to suggest something he had not considered, that the shift in control he had been sensing was not external. It was connected to the person he had just spoken to, and that realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in stages, each detail aligning with the next until the conclusion became unavoidable. And as that understanding settled, his attention sharpened, no longer scanning the room out of habit, but focusing, analyzing, recalibrating, and he moved again, not with the same urgency as before, but with a more deliberate intent, approaching a group of investors who had been speaking with Ava moments earlier, his tone measured, his questions indirect but precise, seeking confirmation without revealing uncertainty, and the responses he received were careful, professional, but within them was the acknowledgement he needed, references to new stakeholders, to strategic direction, to influence that was shaping decisions at a level he could not ignore. And with each answer, the distance between assumption and reality closed further, until there was no space left for denial, only recognition. And across the room, Ava continued her conversations, her attention fully present in each interaction, not distracted, not looking back, because she did not need to monitor what was happening behind her to understand its impact. She had already set the direction, and that was the difference. She was no longer reacting to circumstances. She was creating them. And when their paths crossed again, not by design, but by the natural movement of the room, the dynamic had shifted entirely. Daniel did not ask how she got there this time. He did not question her presence. Instead, he acknowledged it, not in words, but in the way he stood, in the space he allowed, in the absence of the authority he once assumed. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, not just recognition, but the beginning of something he had never needed to express before, accountability, though not fully formed, not yet complete. And Ava listened as she had before, without interruption. But there was no tension in her posture, no anticipation. Only a quiet certainty that whatever he was beginning to understand now had arrived too late to change the outcome. And as the conversation moved forward, it became clear that this was no longer about what had happened in the past. It was about what he was only now starting to realize, that the position he once held without question was no longer his to define, and that the future he assumed would remain unchanged had already been rewritten in ways he could not control. The shift in his voice was subtle, but Ava heard it immediately, because when someone who has always been certain begins to question themselves, it does not sound like weakness. It sounds like something unfamiliar trying to find its place. And Daniel was no longer speaking from the position he once held. He was navigating something he did not fully understand, his words more careful now, measured in a way that suggested he was aware that anything he said could carry consequences he could not control. And as he spoke, attempting to bridge a distance that no longer existed in the way he remembered, Ava did not interrupt. She allowed him to finish, not because she needed to hear it, but because she understood that this moment was not about what he was saying. It was about what he was realizing, and realization, when it comes late, carries a different weight. It is not hopeful. It is reflective. And when he paused, as if expecting a response that might restore something familiar, Ava met his gaze with the same calm clarity that had defined every step she had taken to reach this point. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, not cold, not distant, but grounded in something that did not require validation. She told him that understanding something after it is gone does not return it, and the simplicity of that statement settled into the space between them with a finality that did not need to be emphasized, because it was not meant to hurt. It was meant to define. And Daniel's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the weight of that truth had landed. And for a moment he looked as though he might respond, might try to adjust the conversation, to find a different angle, but there was nothing left to negotiate, because the terms had already been set without his input. And around them the room continued to move, conversations resuming, attention redistributing. But there was still an awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had just taken place, not loudly, not publicly announced, but clearly understood by those who knew how to recognize it. And Ava, without changing her posture, without raising her voice or altering her tone, had redefined the entire dynamic of the moment, not through force, but through presence. And that was what made it irreversible, because what she had built was not something that could be undone with a conversation. It was the result of every decision she had made when no one was watching, every step she had taken when there was no guarantee of where it would lead. And as she stepped back, not retreating, but simply allowing the moment to conclude on her terms, it became clear that whatever Daniel had come to say, whatever he believed he could regain, no longer existed in a form he could reach, and he remained where he was for a second longer, not because he did not know what to do next, but because for the first time, there was nothing he could do to change what had already been decided. And Ava, turning her attention back to the room, continued forward without hesitation, because the path she was on no longer required looking back to confirm its direction. It had already been set long before this moment, and the distance between who she had been and who she had become was now fully visible, not just to him, but to everyone watching closely enough to understand what had truly changed. What happened next was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it carried a weight that settled over the room in a way that no announcement could replicate, because influence, when it reaches a certain level, does not need to be declared. It is simply recognized. And as the evening continued, the subtle shifts that had begun earlier became more defined. Conversations that once centered around Daniel began to orbit elsewhere, not abruptly, not disrespectfully, but naturally, as if the room itself had adjusted to a new center of gravity, and Ava moved through it with the same steady presence, engaging when necessary, listening more than she spoke, and choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that power is not in how much you say, but in when you choose to say it. And across the room, Daniel began to feel what had already taken place, not as a single realization, but as a series of small observations that added up to something undeniable: the way people responded to him, with a fraction less certainty, the way decisions were referenced with language that no longer placed him at the center, the way his name, once a point of authority, was now part of a larger structure he did not fully control. And that was the moment the shift became real, not because of what Ava had said, but because of what he was now experiencing, the difference between having influence and assuming it. And he moved again, not toward her this time, but through the room, attempting to reconnect with the familiar patterns he had relied on for years. But each interaction carried a subtle change, a hesitation, a recalibration, and in those small adjustments, the larger reality became impossible to ignore, because what had once been stable was now evolving without his direction. And at the center of that evolution, whether acknowledged directly or not, was Ava. And she understood this without needing to observe it constantly, because she had already seen the outcome long before. This moment arrived, and when she paused near one of the large windows overlooking the city, the reflection that met her gaze was not one of surprise or even satisfaction. It was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of how far she had come, not measured in titles or ownership, but in the way she now stood, grounded, certain, and unaffected by the need for validation from the past. And Marcus, standing at a distance that was both intentional and respectful, watched without interruption, because his role had never been to shape her path, only to ensure she had the opportunity to define it herself. And as the evening began to draw toward its natural close, the energy in the room settled into a new rhythm, one that reflected the changes that had taken place, not just in structure, but in perception. And Daniel, standing now with a clearer understanding than he had at the beginning of the night, did not approach her again, not because he did not have more to say, but because he understood that the conversation they had already shared had answered more than anything else could. And Ava, turning away from the window and back toward the room one final time, carried herself with the same quiet certainty, not as someone who had proven something, but as someone who no longer needed to, because the outcome was no longer a question. It was a reality that had already been established long before anyone else realized it was happening. The night did not end with applause or a final announcement. It ended the way real shifts in power always do, quietly, almost unnoticed by those who were not paying close enough attention, but undeniable to those who understood what had just taken place. And as people began to leave, their conversations softer now, more reflective, the tone of the room carried something different, not excitement, but acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And Ava moved toward the exit without hesitation, her steps steady, unhurried, as if she had always known exactly where she was going next. And behind her, the structure she had helped reshape continued to settle into its new form, decisions already in motion, outcomes already unfolding. And Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching not her departure, but the space she left behind. Because what he was beginning to understand was not just that she had moved on, it was that she had built something entirely separate from anything he could reach, something that did not rely on his recognition or his approval. And that realization carried a weight he had never had to consider before, because for the first time, he was not the one being chosen. He was the one being left out of the decision entirely. And as he finally turned away, engaging in conversations that now felt different, more careful, more uncertain, it became clear that the position he once held without question was now something he would have to navigate rather than command. And outside, the air was cooler, the city quieter than it had been earlier, and Ava paused briefly at the top of the steps, not to look back, but to take in the moment as it was, complete, resolved, not because everything had been said, but because nothing more needed to be, and Marcus joined her without announcement, standing beside her in the same way he always had, present but not imposing, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because some outcomes do not require confirmation. They simply exist, and when he finally did speak, his words were as measured as ever, not asking what came next, but acknowledging that whatever she chose would now be entirely hers. And Ava understood the meaning behind that, because the path she had taken was no longer defined by recovery or reaction, it was defined by direction, by choice, by the ability to move forward without being tied to where she had started. And as the car door opened and the city lights reflected across its surface, she stepped forward without hesitation, not as someone leaving something behind, but as someone moving towards something that had already begun. And inside, as the car pulled away from the curb, the building faded into the distance, just another part of a story that no longer defined her. And what remained was not the memory of what had happened, but the certainty of what she had become, something steady, something independent, something that did not need to return to the past to confirm its value, because it had already created something new, something that would continue to grow long after this night had ended. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the car window, reflections shifting across the glass like quiet reminders of how far everything had come, and Ava sat still, not lost in thought, but grounded in something deeper than reflection, because this was not a moment of looking back, it was a moment of understanding, the kind that does not arrive suddenly, but builds over time until it becomes undeniable. And as the car moved through the quiet streets, past places that once would have meant something different, she realized that the life she had now was not a return, not a correction of what had been lost, but an entirely new direction that had never depended on where she started. And that was what made it real, not the success, not the recognition, but the independence of it, the fact that nothing about who she had become required permission from the past to exist. And somewhere across the city, in a building that now felt smaller than it once did, Daniel Whitmore stood in a space that no longer responded to him the same way. The conversations around him continuing, the structure still intact, but different, subtly, undeniably, because once control begins to shift, it does not return to its original form, it evolves, and he understood that now, not all at once, but enough to recognize that the moment he thought he could revisit had already passed long before he tried to reach it, and what remained was not a question of what could be fixed, but an awareness of what could not. And that awareness carried a silence that no explanation could fill. And back in the car, Ava's phone screen lit up briefly with messages, updates, confirmations, the ongoing rhythm of the life she had built continuing without interruption, and she glanced at it for a moment before setting it aside, because for the first time, none of it felt urgent, none of it felt like something she needed to chase or prove. It simply existed as part of a path she had already claimed. And as the car slowed near her destination, the quiet hum of the engine fading into stillness, she stepped out into a night that felt different from the one she had once walked through alone, not because the world had changed, but because she had, and that difference was everything. And as she moved forward, her steps steady, her presence unshaken, there was no need to revisit what had been left behind, no need to respond to what had already revealed itself too late. Because the value of what she had built was not in the way others now saw it, but in the fact that it existed without them, and somewhere in the distance, the echo of a moment that once defined her no longer held any weight, replaced by something quieter, stronger, something that did not need to be announced to be understood, because some outcomes are not measured by what is regained, but by what is no longer needed. And in that silence, in that absence of anything left to prove, the story reached its true conclusion, not in words, not in declarations, but in the simple reality that the woman who had once been left behind had already moved so far forward that there was nothing left for her to return to.